All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this morning. My name is Lindsay Bicknell, and I'm with Utah Business, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar hosted by our friends at Holland Hart. Today, we will be talking about the Biden administration's conservation agenda and Utah's public lands. Joining us today from Holland Hart is Angela Franklin, the Energy and Resources Partner, who will be moderating this discussion for us today. Before I turn it over to Angela, I do just want to let all of you know that we will be holding a Q&A session throughout the webinar today. So if you have any questions, let us know by typing into that Q&A box on your screen, and we'll have Angela and our panelists today address your questions. We will also have a video of today's webinar on our website after we finish, utahbusiness.com. So you'll be able to revisit our discussion today and share it with all of your friends. All right, Angela, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us. My name is Angela Franklin, and I'm a natural resources and energy attorney and partner at the law firm of Holland Hart. And through our work with clients in all aspects of the energy industry, we've been delving into topics and issues that are going to be discussed today. And with the change in administrations in both Washington and Utah, we thought you, our audience, would be also interested in these topics, and not just from a legal or regulatory perspective, but from a broader business perspective and as citizens of the state of Utah. We are fortunate to have assembled an impressive panel of experts. All of today's panelists have extensive backgrounds in Utah policies and politics, energy, public lands, and the environment. We are honored to have them join us, and we are grateful for their willingness to do so and for their time. We only have 60 minutes and lots to cover, and so I'm going to dispense with reciting their credentials. But I encourage you to take a moment after the webinar to Google each of them and discover how fortunate we are to have them join us today. We are going to go through and have a short presentation by each one of our panelists, and then we will delve into the question and answer section. We're hoping to reserve about 15 minutes at the end. And so I'm going to begin with John Ruppel. He is a professor of law and the Wallace Stegner Center Fellow at the University of Utah, S.J. Quinney College of Law. Professor Ruppel.
Thanks, Angela, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Let me share my screen here and we'll kick things off. All right, so are you able to see that? Okay, great. I thought I'd start with a map of the state of Utah, or actually the United States. This is a map from 1839. And if you look here, so you my cursor in place, this is the Great Salt Lake. Can I point this out? Because as of 1839, you can see what we think of as Utah today was part of Mexico. The Spaniards came in, they obtained title to this landscape via conquest over Native Americans. The Mexican people then fought a war of independence, secured title, and then the United States fought a war with Mexico, the Mexican-American War, and in 1849, we signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the Mexican government conveyed to the federal government of the United States title to much of what we now consider the Southwest of the United States, including the state of Utah. So I think this is kind of an important background concept when we think about the relationship between the federal government and the state, when we think about the relationship, between tribes and indigenous people and both the federal and state government. So from 1849, the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, up until 1896, the Utah landscape, this was a federal territory. The federal government held claim to most of the land in the state. In 1896, Utah became a state, and at which point the federal government conveyed significant acreage over to the state. It was about 7.5 million acres at statehood. The idea was the federal government was land rich, but cash poor. The state needed revenue and resources in order to develop, so the federal government conveyed a significant chunk of resources. Most of this went in support of public schools, and as we'll see in a second, these grants were made in individual parcels, usually one square mile in size, that were distributed evenly across the landscape. The idea was that in so doing, this would allow for kind of even development of all parts of the state. Now, in addition to this, I should say, the federal government also made significant grants to businesses and private individuals. They made railroad grants of, I think, about 2.2 million acres to help support development of the Transcontinental Railroad. We had another 3.5 million acres or so granted to homesteaders. So in total, there were about 7.5 million acres that were granted to the state, and about an equal number that went to private parties and individuals. So it's a significant grant, and it's reflected in the landscape that we're looking at today. So if we look at a map of Utah, the colors here represent the different owners. And I'm going to focus here on three main interests. Green lands here are managed by the U.S. Forest Service. Those are national forests. The yellow lands, these are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. We typically call these public lands. And I'm lumping those together because they're what we call multiple use lands. They're managed under a multiple use sustained yield mandate that requires federal agencies to consider competing uses: logging, mining, grazing, but also things like recreation, wildlife habitat, and watershed protection. A whole host of resources that are often kind of challenging to manage. Now, when we look at these blue lands here, these individual little dots, those are those 1 square mile parcels that were granted to the state upon admission to the Union. We can see that some of those have been blocked up, but oftentimes they're scattered across that landscape. And it's important because these are our school and institutional trust lands, and they're managed under a very different mandate. SITLA manages these lands to generate revenue, to maximize long-term revenue generation on behalf of trust beneficiaries. So that sets up kind of a built-in tension about management. And as you can see with that kind of fragmented crazy quilt landscape, that can pose challenges. And we'll talk more about those as we continue. And the scope of these challenges, it's significant when we think about it in economic terms. When we look just at federal lands, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of income and revenue to the state. Now, federal lands typically are not subject to state property taxes, but the federal government pays what are called PILT payments, or payments in lieu of taxes, to the state. That averages upwards of $41 million a year, at least in last year. There are also revenue sharing payments for where the state receives a share of the revenue generated from BLM or Forest Service or other federal lands. But the biggest part is revenue sharing that's tied to mineral development on federal lands. The state receives 48% of the revenue that comes in from oil and gas development. In 2020, that was almost $73 million. So that's a big chunk of cash, $125 million in federal payments directly to the state, plus the kind of tax revenue that the state generates based on severance on oil and gas that's developed or things associated with that. And that doesn't even touch on recreation related values. So we think about the economic return generated by recreation in Utah. We can see that federal lands are a significant driver of our economy, and they have a significant impact on our quality of life. So I think I'll stop there, turn it over to my co-panelists, and we can pick up questions in a bit.
Thank you, Professor Ruppel. Our next speaker is going to be Greg Sheehan, and he is the State Director of the Utah State Office of the Bureau of Land Management. Director Sheehan.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, John, for that good overview and taking us back in time a little bit. That's always interesting for me to see and learn more about. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss our mission here at Utah BLM and the priorities as we talk about those with other esteemed panel members today. As Angela said, my name is Greg Sheehan. I proudly serve as the Bureau of Land Management Utah State Director. Before joining the BLM, I previously served as the Principal Deputy Director of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C. And even going back before that, I worked for 25 years at the Utah Department of Natural Resources and served the last 5 of those years as the director of the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. I strongly believe that our public lands in Utah are among the most beautiful and resource-rich lands in the nation. Our stewardship will ensure that they remain so for future generations. The BLM's mission, and John touched on this as far as how we manage public lands, but the BLM's mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. This multiple use sustained yield mission is mandated by the Federal Lands Policy Management Act of 1976, or FLPMA as it's most commonly referred. And it enables the BLM to contribute to economic growth, job creation, and generating revenues for federal and state treasuries and local economies, as has been described earlier. We're also passionate about working closely with our partners, tribes, local, state, and other federal agencies, and building strong relationships with our partners and the public. Today, as was requested, I want to discuss a few of our multiple uses that contribute to Utah's economy. As a background, and John mentioned some of this, but BLM Utah manages 23 million acres of public lands and 36 million acres of mineral estate in Utah. Some of those are on Forest Service lands, et cetera. Overall, commercial activities on public lands in Utah were estimated to generate nearly $4 billion in economic output in 2019 and supports roughly 24,000 jobs in areas of recreation, grazing, minerals, et cetera. That activity is the economic driver for many local communities, as well as an important generator of tax revenues that support state and local governments. We're one of the few government agencies, federal government agencies, that provide a significant amount of revenue to the Department of Treasury as compared to what we actually receive back in BLM and our annual appropriations. Some of the priority conversations of the Biden administration. We are at the Bureau of Land Management, an agency within the Department of Interior. And as representatives of the executive branch, we support administration priorities as established by the President and the Secretary of Interior. A few weeks ago, on May 6th, President Biden issued a call to action to conserve, connect, and restore 30% of our lands and waters by 2030 for the sake of our economy, our health, and well-being. The initiative is referred to as Conserving and Restoring America the Beautiful, will be a decade-long challenge to pursue the locally led, voluntary, nationwide efforts to conserve, connect, and restore the lands, waters, and wildlife upon which we all depend. I don't know if you've seen that report, anyone? I'll show you what the cover of it looks like. Hopefully you can see that okay on the Zoom screen here. But it's not particularly long, but I think it covers a number of topics, and some of those I'll touch on here in just a moment. It does fit within the multiple use mission of BLM, as we've talked about, and emphasizes increasing recreation, hunting and fishing access, preventing wildfires, supporting grazing on public lands, and supporting conservation initiatives. Our goal is to work closely with local communities, stakeholders, tribes, and our agency partners to ensure that we're making right decisions using the best available information and science. Recreation is a high priority for me as Utah State Director, as we've seen over the last year how valuable Utah's great outdoors can be for the public and how access to open spaces enriches all of our lives. Speaking more to recreation, last year, unlike any other year in our history, of our lifetimes at least, many people flocked to public lands to enjoy the outdoors while remaining socially distant. We experienced an unusually high rate of challenges: trash, human waste, crowding at trailheads and campgrounds, difficulty in some cases in parking, and an increase of dispersed recreation, or those who are maybe camping or recreating outside of a normally developed campground or recreation area such as Little Sahara. We're looking into ways, and we're really striving to figure out how we can address these increases and changes in both recreation through providing useful information, helping share a message, and I hope you would all do that with us, recreating responsibly and safely, and also working on projects to improve our infrastructure, recreation infrastructure, visitor experience. I think Reg is going to talk a little bit about some of the funding for Great American Outdoors Act and other sources. Tourism to public lands provides important revenues to residents of rural towns throughout Utah in the form of lodging, gas, and supplies. We understand that. And we also provide many opportunities for small and large businesses to make a living through our special recreation permit programs. We have in Utah that we manage BLM 508 developed recreation sites, and we issue just over 1,200 special recreation permits or authorizations, if you will, SRPs we call those, for those to essentially, in most cases, run some sort of business activity. Could be river rafting, guiding, different sorts of things. And as a matter of context, BLM is in many states of our nation, but more than 25% of all the SRPs, the special recreation permits, are located within Utah. So we're very, very busy here in the state, and we're glad to play an important role in Utah's recreation economy. Renewable energy. I think you've all heard a lot about that and wondered, where does that fit in the energy realm here in Utah? So, we've been asked to look at ways under the new administration to support more renewable energy projects, including solar, wind, geothermal, and then the associated rights of ways that help get that energy, those clean energy sources to consumers. Those rights of way, if you will, that we issue under what we call Title V authorizations can be for many different sources, transmission lines, those sorts of efforts. Geothermal development projects, which we have in Utah. We have geothermal power plants that are up and running right now in Utah, and they're authorized by the issuance of leases and approvals to drill permits and utilization under the Geothermal Steam Act of 1970. So all of those take place under NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act. In December of 2020, about 6 months ago, we issued or had a large geothermal lease sale, 28 parcels. All of those have been sold and had great interest. We're planning to, right now, working through the NEPA process for public comment to potentially hold a geothermal lease sale this fall of 2021. As for solar, BLM has 3 designated solar energy zones, so covering about 19,000 acres. We're working to increase utilization in some of those areas. We're also working on renewable energy and throughout other parts of the state. Most of those solar energy zones are in Southeast Utah, but other offices as well. We've got a large wind project to work on, a number of transmission line projects. Oil and gas, I know many of you are interested in that topic. And it's an important part of our multiple use portfolio. We have, many thousands or more than a couple thousand leases out there, and we're following administration guidance when we consider how to manage oil and gas leasing in Utah. But we recognize that energy development is an important economic driver for Utah and Utah schools, as John talked about a few minutes ago. When President Biden came into office in January, he issued an executive order 14008. And at that time, it asked for, one, a pause on new oil and gas leases, not on production, but on new leases that would go out. And then concurrent with a review of the oil and gas program. That review is underway. There was a meeting hosted, I don't know, it's probably a month or so ago now. That was a bit of a kickoff of that review, or a component of that review, as leadership tries to get a better understanding of what directions they want to take with oil and gas management here in the state and around the country. It's important to note, though, and I kind of alluded, that pause does not impact existing operations for permits for valid leases, which are continuing to be reviewed and approved. So if you have an existing lease, if you want to drill on that, you'd come to us for an application to drill an APD, and we continue to process those. We've processed many of those under this new administration and have many that we're working through right now. So we do work with a broad spectrum of stakeholders and tribes to inform these policies as we move forward. So kind of a conclusion, I've probably taken too much time, but I wanted to note that BLM continues to manage many other multiple uses that fall under FLPMA and administration priorities. Livestock grazing, you're all familiar with, wild horses and burros, fire and fuels management, as well as protecting natural and cultural resources. So those are all areas that we have a lot of commitment to and resource management here with Utah BLM. I guess lastly, we're proud to support Utah's economy, promote opportunities for those recreation, jobs, enjoyment of our great outdoors. And Angela, I appreciate the opportunity to speak again to all of you online today and to be part of this panelist group. And I look forward to further conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Sheehan. We appreciate you being with us. Our next panelist is Reg Johnson. He is the Executive Director of Utah's Public Lands Policy and Coordinating Office. Director.
Angela, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'd also like to thank Utah Business and Holland Hart for the opportunity to join you on this webinar today. And John and Greg, thanks for setting up a good discussion. I'm going to go a little more into the 30 by 30 and offer some of the state's insights into some of the new administration's actions and how they may affect public lands. As John mentioned in his presentation, over 60% of the state of Utah is publicly or federally controlled, either through BLM, Forest Service, Parks, or the Military Department of Defense. So Utah has long been very serious in how we look at our public lands and how we interact with our great federal partners in BLM and Forest Service and the Park Service. We appreciate all the great work that they do and the management of the landscapes. We do sometimes need to have a little bit different perspective because we're also trying to provide local jobs, local products, et cetera. So I'm going to just dive right into the 30 by 30 initiative. And we do have some concerns, but one of the biggest concerns right now is we don't know exactly where they're going with the 30 by 30 initiative. And there's a lot of vague language in the 30 by 30 initiative, and we're trying to wrap our head around exactly where they want to go. One of the big questions we have, I guess, for the administration is this going to be representative in every state, kind of a 30% of every state that's taken under the 30 of 30 initiative and the conservation thereof, or are we going to do it regionally, or how is that going to be broken down? And the last document that we have, which Greg showed to you, it doesn't really indicate about how they're going to categorize what lands they want to take, and or shouldn't say take, but provide in conservation. And when we look at conservation across the state of Utah feels that a good portion of our landscape is already conserved. And whether you're looking at wilderness study areas, wilderness, national conservation areas, national monuments, parks, roadless rural areas, et cetera, the state and our public lands, we view that a good portion, 30 to 60% of our state is already in a conserved status. And so we're concerned that more designations may be where the administration's going, and that's a real concern for us. Designations do not always indicate a good way to manage property. A lot of times we need active management on the landscape. And I'll give you an example of that, and that's forest fires. Since the fires of 1910, we've had an increase in our fuel loads all across the West. And we've seen now, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, how that increase in fuel loads without active management, with a decrease in timber harvesting or logging, how that fire fuel load accumulation makes it really difficult to suppress the fires when they do happen. So we're a little concerned that more designations may be problematic for active management on the landscape. And whether we're talking fire or water quality, air quality, there are a lot of impacts that can happen by having too much designation on a landscape. We do support conservation. We feel that there is definitely a role for conservation in the state of Utah, and we fully support that. However, we also have some concerns that if we're not able to actively manage, then that creates some conflicts. And there is also a bit of a conflict with the conservation 30 by 30 and the administration's promotion of a new Green Deal. And where we see that conflict occurring is if we're going to move toward Green New Deal, we'll need a lot more minerals to provide the raw materials, whether we're talking copper for improving the charging or the utility lines, if we're talking critical minerals, rare earth elements, things like that. They're vital to a green new economy or an electrified transportation system. I look back to what we were doing in the 70s and 80s, where we had thumper trucks all across the landscape. And are we going to be doing the same thing with the public lands, looking for critical minerals, rare earth elements? And then are we going to make the next step, which is developing those minerals, and where will we develop them? I saw that there's some critical minerals in what was part of the grand staircase. And, there's a discussion now about, well, should we carve that piece out and develop those critical minerals for the new economy? And so we have more questions, I think, than we have answers on the 30 by 30 initiative. And the state of Utah is being proactive, working with the administration, pointing out that, there is a very large portion of our landscape that is already in a conserved status. When you look at FLTMA, and NIFMA and all the other acts that have put some kind of conservation status on these landscapes, we hope that they recognize that. Another item that I'd like to talk about, we talked about a little bit, is forest management. We did hear some good news out of the administration about doing more active fire management, fuel load reduction. And I was just in a meeting earlier this morning on shared stewardship. The federal agencies are very aware that we have some challenges in that area, and I look forward to working with the administration on that as well. And the last one we hope to work with the administration on would be water infrastructure. As you know, as everybody on the call knows, we're in a severe drought right now. And we're hoping that as we move forward with an infrastructure emphasis with the administration, that they may look at water infrastructure. As we live in this very dry climate and we're in this drought scenario, we will definitely need to move forward with some very significant infrastructure improvements to provide water for an ever expanding population. Greg did mention that I would go into a little bit on the Great American Outdoors Act. I would just like to point out that as the state of Utah gets a lot of funding from oil and gas, the Great American Outdoors Act is also funded through oil and gas sales or oil and gas revenue. So if we bring that revenue down, it's going to impact things like the Great American Outdoors Act. And I see Angela came on, which probably means that my time is up. So I'm going to say thank you very much. It's great joining you today, and I'll hand it back to you, Angela. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Johnson. Appreciate it. Our next panelist is Matt Anderson. He is the Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Energy and Development. Deputy Director Anderson.
Yes, thank you, Angela, and appreciation to all the panelists in the background that you gave. That was wonderful. And also to Holland Hart for hosting this event. It's great to be part of it and to share this information with all of you. To begin, I just want to give a quick background about what the Governor's Office of Energy Development is, because we're a small government agency here in Utah. The mission of the Governor's Office of Energy Development is to advance the Governor's energy vision, implement state energy policy, and enhance Utah's energy infrastructure, technology, and workforce to provide more affordable, reliable, and cleaner energy options for Utah households and businesses. So essentially, we do a lot of things, but if I had to narrow it down to 5, here they are. One thing that we do is we administer tax credits. So if you put solar panels on your home, or a business does, we're involved in processing those, as well as high infrastructure tax credits to bring transmission lines, as well as other energy related infrastructure to the state. We help process those tax credits. We help educate the public about energy production transmission so they know where their power comes from. It's not just a magic when you turn on your light switch. It actually comes from somewhere. And then we work with universities and trade schools to make sure that we have an educated workforce here in Utah for energy's future here in the state. We also do a lot of outreach to businesses here in the state to make sure that Utah stays a business-friendly environment for energy producers and transmitters. And then lastly, we serve as a resource to the governor, and policymakers on energy-related issues for legislation or executive orders, whatever it may be. So kind of diving in here, Utah is a very, very rich energy state, and a lot of those energy resources are found on federal lands. In fact, Utah has so much energy that we produce more than we can use, and we export that energy across the West and power many Western states, including California. The Biden administration's policies and goals offer both challenges and opportunities for Utah's energy future. While many of the administration's policies and goals are still in the works and up in the air, at this point, all we can do is speculate about their impacts, as was kind of mentioned by Reg with the 30 by 30 or America the Beautiful initiative. We're not exactly sure what it means, but we're trying to speculate on that at that point until we have more information. My comments today will focus on 3 of the Biden administration's priorities. 1 is cutting greenhouse emissions, 2, the oil and gas moratorium that was implemented on January 27th, and the America the Beautiful initiative and how they will impact Utah's energy future. So first, going to the cutting greenhouse emissions. The United States only accounts for 14% of global emissions, but we're making aggressive steps to reduce those emissions. President Biden has stated that the United States will cut its greenhouse emissions in half based on 2005 levels by the end of the decade. And Utah has a goal in that, and our federal lands actually have a role in reducing that. We have a lot of wind generation down in Beaver County. In fact, the county commissioners down there have been very supportive, as well as others, in putting up wind turbines to make sure that we can power our state and others. We have a lot of geothermal resources. That's not really known across our state, but the West Desert has a lot of extinct volcanoes and other geologic features that make it usable for geothermal uses, and emerging technologies is making that even more possible. Of course, solar in southern Utah is a huge component of this too. It's hot down there, and there's a lot of sunshine, doesn't rain very often. And so we have a lot of solar that can help to reduce emissions on the production of energy. And of course, we have some hydroelectric dams across the state as well, especially in the northern part of the state. So this is a side note that's not really related to public lands, but news coverage likes to target industry or the transportation sector, saying that they generate the largest share of greenhouse gases. But really, it's vehicles is the real issue. 29% of all greenhouse emissions in 2019 came from vehicles. And so we're going to have to address that. We're going to have to look at different ways to get around, whether that's electric cars or hydrogen, whatever it may be. And we're going to have to implement infrastructure to do that, like charging stations. And that's going to be a challenge in a place like Utah that's so large. We're going to have to put those in rural places that don't have very many people if they're going to use it as well. The second thing was the America the Beautiful, also known as the 30 by 30 initiative. And again, it says that we're going to conserve 30% of America's lands by 2030. Now, we don't exactly know what this means quite yet, but it could be more national parks, national monuments, or wilderness areas. And if those do indeed happen, that will decrease the ability of Utah to produce both fossil fuels and green energy. It can, for example, it can make it more difficult to put up oil wells and gas rigs and everything like that, but also putting up solar panels and wind turbines on federal land become far more difficult, if not entirely precluded, if that happens. I think something else to remember, and Reg hit on this already, is that all energy comes from the ground. I'm not talking just about fossil fuels. I'm talking about solar panels and wind turbines and everything else we use. It comes from the ground. It has to be mined somewhere. And critical minerals will be critical, minerals will be critical to the clean energy future envisioned by the current administration. We're going to have them. And unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of those critical minerals are coming from foreign nations, and they will not be able to meet the supply that we need. In fact, according to the International Energy Agency, if the world is to reach net zero by 2050, overall demand for critical minerals will increase by a factor of 6. And so if you're not able to mine these minerals, many of which are found on our federal lands, it's going to put us at a significant disadvantage, rising costs for green energy and potentially making it impossible to do so. I mean, a lot of these things, for instance, lithium, nickel, cobalt, magnesium, and graphite are critical to battery technology, which we're going to have to store this energy. Rare earth minerals are essential for permanent magnets in wind turbines and electrical vehicles. Then Reg, of course, mentioned copper is kind of a cornerstone for all technologies. Utah hosts 28 of the critical minerals that the government has on its list of 35, and we produce 6 of them. And so we're going to have to find a way to do it. The other problem that we're going to run into if we have more national parks, national monuments, and other lands that preclude uses is the transmission. We're not going to be able to put transmission lines across them, which would make it more difficult to get energy to where it needs to go. And without that, I think my boss, Tom Carter, put it best: energy is useless, power is what we need. So if you can't get it where it needs to go, it doesn't do anything. The last thing I'm going to touch on here is the oil and gas moratorium that the administration implemented. Essentially, it says that no new oil or gas leases will be implemented on federal land, as Greg Sheehan mentioned. In the short term, this may not be an issue, but in the long term, it really could be, and it could result in concentrated job losses in rural communities across the West. About 22% of all U.S. oil production is reliant on federal lands and waters, and most of Utah's lands are managed for multiple use and can have drilling on them, like BLM and some U.S. Forest Service lands. Again, as Greg mentioned, it's not an issue now, but moving forward, it could be significant depending on how it lasts and depending on the price of oil and gas. If those prices go up and we don't have an ability to drill here, it could impact it. The Wyoming Energy Authority determined that the ban on new leasing alone would impact 58,000 jobs in 8 states that make up the majority of public land production, including Utah. I think that we need to also recognize that it will hit certain counties more than others. Out in the Uinta Basin, Duchesne and Uinta counties are heavily reliant on those. Yes, there's a lot of oil and gas drilling that goes on private land and tribal land, but as they need to look to other places for new resources, they won't have the opportunity to. And that will also impact other businesses that rely on the oil and gas industry, including restaurants and hotels and other industries there. And so it can have a big impact. We haven't seen it yet, but we are gearing up for that as well. So again, energy production is huge on federal land. We have a lot of energy resources. We have a lot of places that we can go, but it's important that we have access to those. With that, I'll turn it back to Angela.
Thank you, Deputy Director Anderson. Appreciate your comments. Our final panelist will be Bill Myers. He's an energy, natural resources, and public lands attorney and partner at Holland Hart. Mr. Myers.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks for inviting me to join this august collection of speakers. I bring a slightly different perspective, I think, to the discussion, not academic, not governmental, but more private sector oriented, because that is our client base, and those are the people that I serve on these issues dealing with public lands and how they are managed by administrations. I've picked out several issues that I want to discuss, and then I'll have also a collection of what might be opportunities or challenges, and I'll do that as briefly as I can. There's so much to cover, but I've chosen a few. The first one is sage grouse. This is an ongoing issue in Utah, covers a lot of the state. I've been involved in this matter for clients in Utah for a number of years, including in a case now called Cox v. Hayland. Started out as Herbert v. Jewell, and it was filed in 2016. And I, along with the Attorney General's office, represent the governor in that action. That was a challenge to the 2015 sage grouse plans developed by the BLM. Those plans were followed by plan amendments in 2019. Judge Windmill in the federal district court in Idaho enjoined Utah's plan. That was followed by more BLM planning and analysis in 2020 to try to address Judge Windmill's concerns, and a record of decision in 2021. I give you that chronology just to show how these issues seem to be flowing from administration to administration. This case alone is in its third administration, if you will, between Obama, Trump, and now Biden. The cost of these analyses by the BLM and the Forest Service are extraordinarily high. Over the 3 different planning sessions of 2015, 19, and 20, the cost has been some $17 million just to produce the 48,000 pages of NEPA analysis and addressing 16,000 substantive comments. It does give rise to the question and the old phrase of paralysis by analysis, because there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. More planning is on the horizon, and some of the lingering issues are conflicts of sage grouse with other commodity or resource uses, One of the most obvious that comes to my mind is where you might have sage grouse leks in the same location where you have a very valuable wind energy resource. Wind energy, as Director Sheehan said, is a priority of this administration, and so is sage grouse. So it'll be interesting to see how they balance those. Another issue that's always in the news in Utah is the monuments, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. Again, I have Utah clients in that litigation, which is in the federal district court in the District of Columbia. President Biden asked Secretary Haaland to review the status of the two monuments and provide recommendations, and she's in the process of doing that, having visited the state and taking advice from her counselors within the department. The litigation is over the question simply as to whether a president can lawfully reduce the size of a monument. That's not a new thing. That was not new to President Trump. That's been done 18 times in the past, but it's never been challenged in court. So the pending litigation is the first court challenge over whether that's a legitimate use by a president of the Antiquities Act of 1906. The act does require that the areas that are designated be the smallest areas compatible with the proper care and management of a monument. But of course, that's a very subjective standard. And I certainly expect that President Biden is going to make some changes to the existing monuments, and we'll just have to see how those play out. And then the other question that's parallel to that is whether President Biden will have an appetite for use of the Antiquities Act and start designating other public lands as monuments in addition to those two and other monuments that are in the state and in the West. Another issue, which perhaps doesn't have quite the geographic imprint or the imprint on public uses, is wilderness designations, but they are important in Utah. And of course, under the Wilderness Act, those that are designated by Congress are fully protected wilderness areas. You have wilderness study areas that are not designated, but have the status, if you will, of a designated area because they cannot be impaired as to their wilderness characteristics. Then below that tier, you have something called lands with wilderness characteristics, which is not a wilderness area and not a study area, but something that seems to have those characteristics. And the question there is, what is the management scheme that a land management agency such as the BLM will impose on those lands? This issue is becoming rather heated in a fairly new context, but an interesting one, at least from my perspective, and that is the question of the use of bicycles on wilderness areas, and perhaps then the use of e-bikes on wilderness areas or wilderness study areas. So that discussion will continue, I think, in earnest and with passion. As far as some of the development opportunities and challenges, we've already heard from, I think, virtually everyone except Professor Ruppel about the 30 by 30 initiative. It was on my list as well, but I won't repeat that, except to point out that one of the recommendations that's highlighted in the 30 by 30 proposal is wildlife corridors. And wildlife corridors, by definition, can be very long and expansive when you have migratory wildlife. And so the question might be as to how that wildlife corridor strategy will overlay on the map of Utah and what that will mean for uses that may not currently be impaired by a corridor, but could be in the future if a corridor is given some official status and protection. I can't let it pass that you probably saw in the news that Senator Durbin of Illinois has introduced the America's Red Rock Wilderness Act as part of that initiative and designating parts of Utah as additional wilderness. Senator Romney and Representative Curtis responded with the Shawnee Wilderness Area Designation Act, targeted, not surprisingly, at Illinois. Illinois, by the way, has 1% of its lands in federal ownership compared to 61% of Utah. And that 1% of Illinois consists of less than 500,000 acres, which is essentially the size of a decent BLM grazing allotment in Utah. So those battles are playing out on many fronts. The NEPA regulations that so many of the federal decisions must comply with are in flux. The Trump administration changed those in September of 2020. Those are still in effect. I'm sure they're being reviewed by the Biden administration. We'll take Administrative Procedure Act compliance to change those, possibly Congressional Review Act review as well, but I know that those are going to be changed in the coming months or years. Similarly, the waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act, and that designation will have a big impact on Utah's tributaries and wetlands. Currently, the Trump administration revisions from April of 2020 are in effect. There are numerous lawsuits pending against it, but none of them have succeeded in joining those 2020 regulations at this point in time. Not to say that that will not change as the cases proceed to the merits. But again, it's another example of a large swath of Utah and its waters that are in doubt or in limbo as to how the administration is going to deal with this. So, Angela, I think I will pause there. I see we have 15 minutes, so that should give us some time, I hope, for questions. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. Appreciate your comments. If I could ask all the panelists to turn on their cameras, and we will move into the question and answer situation. And I want to begin, I apologize, one moment. I live next to the Air Force Base and I can't control when the jets fly over my house. So I don't know if you heard that or not. But I want to begin with Professor Ruppel. Could you just give us a quick status on the federal oil and gas pause litigation, and to the extent you're comfortable speculating on any changes to the federal oil and gas leasing program?
Sorry, hit the wrong button there. Sure. Let's see. So litigation on oil and gas leasing. So as we already heard, we have an executive order essentially directing the BLM to pause future oil and gas leases. So this is a decision that doesn't have any effect on development of existing leases. It doesn't have any effect on existing operations, and it also applies only to federal land. It has no impact on state land or private land. So we have this executive order that's being implemented by the BLM, and then we have two lawsuits challenging it, one in Wyoming and one in Louisiana. They raise similar questions. I think kind of the interesting one for us comes out of the Louisiana case. It deals with the Mineral Leasing Act. The language of that basically says that that lands that are subject to the act may be leased by the Secretary of the Interior, and that leases shall be held for each state where lands are eligible and available. So there's some caveats to that language, and the question I think before the court is essentially, what is the obligation to lease? Environmentalists would say that lands may be leased when necessary and appropriate. I think the counter argument is that there's an obligation to lease lands routinely. In both the Wyoming and Louisiana cases, they're up for what's called a preliminary injunction. So we're moving forward on that. And I think it's important to understand what that means. That's essentially not a ruling on the merits, it's preliminary relief. And there are three things that plaintiffs are going to have to address there. One is that there's a real immediate threat of injury. And I think that may be a bit of a challenge here for the plaintiffs, because when we look at the federal landscape, we know that there are over 9 million acres of lands that have already been leased but are undeveloped. They're not producing. We know there are another almost 14 million acres. I'm sorry, that's offshore lands. Those are our in waters. Then we have about 14 million acres of onshore land that have been leased that aren't in production. So, and there are upwards of 7,700 drilling permits on federal land that have already been issued that aren't in place. So I think there's a counter argument here on the part of the federal government that a short-term pause isn't going to slow oil and gas development. In terms of the second prong is whether there's a balance of equities, how that fares between the plaintiffs and defendants. And I think here there's a big question about royalties. When we look at federal oil and gas, the federal government receives a 12.5% royalty from development that goes back into the treasury. When we compare that, I should say that's for on federal lands. Compare that to offshore, it's twice as much. Compare that to the royalty that most states generate, it ranges from 16 2/3 up to 25% in Texas. So I think there's an argument here that the federal government may be appropriate in taking a temporary pause to ask whether the American taxpayer is receiving an adequate return on their investment. So I think part of this is going to turn on how long this pause lasts, but there are at least some pretty strong arguments on behalf of the federal government against the preliminary injunction. Now, if the preliminary injunction is granted, then presumably BLM will have to move forward with lease sales. If not, then we continue on the merits of the case and ask whether the executive order was appropriately issued. But by the time we answer that question, presumably the analysis will be done and the DOI will be back to issuing oil and gas leases.
Thank you. We've got several questions, so I'm just going to go through them and read them. The first one is to everyone, and so I will read the question and then we'll just go in the order that we originally presented. We know that many of the mainstream companies have chosen to invest in Utah and have done so due to the high quality of life our public lands provide. The jobs and revenues these companies bring are in addition to the more direct energy and recreation revenues related to public lands. Can each of the panelists speak to how they see these indirect benefits of public land? And Professor Ruppel, although you just spoke, you're our first up, so.
Sure, I'll be real brief and then turn it over to others. I guess I'd start by saying that, recreation is obviously a huge part of who we are as a state. It defines a lot of our identity. It's a tremendous value, and it's a tremendous value economically. It's a driver, I think, as Ashley pointed out, that draws industry and people to the state. And the economics, it's a little difficult to tease out how much of that's directly related to public lands versus private and state lands, but generally the numbers indicate that more revenue is generated from recreation and from our oil and gas industry. And we think about that, we often think about places like Moab when we think about that revenue and recreation, but it's important to remember, our ski industry is largely built on public lands, that a lot of those ski areas operate on national forest system lands, and part of that revenue, part of that, that recreation experience is there, and then part of that revenue comes back to the state. So this is really a big part of who we are, both economically and I think culturally.
Thank you. Director Sheehan?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what John said. People, and with the panel question to the panel members, of course, a lot of people are coming to Utah now, or perhaps they're not coming here to Utah, but elect to stay here in Utah because of the many natural resources that we have in these beautiful areas that allow for recreation and other visitations. So, I think here at Bureau of Land Management, we try to and have, regardless of administrations, try to always be respectful and understand that those are important values to the citizens of Utah and others who come to visit here, and manage our recreation resources and other opportunities on the landscape to provide for all of those who want to appreciate and use those landscapes. So I expect we'll continue to do more of that in the future.
Director Johnson?
So thank you. I appreciate the question. And I agree that, a lot of companies, I think, move here or stay here because of the public lands that we're able to enjoy and the wonderful lifestyle that we have here. It is unfortunate, though, that too often we view this as a zero-sum game, where we're looking at it as either one, recreation, or oil and gas, or mining, or other things, and we can't have all of the above. And I really think that we can, especially in the state of Utah. I look across the landscape, and in some areas we have recreation and oil and gas and mining all within a mile or two of each other. I look at the Salt Lake Valley, and on one side of the valley we have world-class skiing, and on the other side we have one of the world's largest copper mines, and in between we have a lot of development going on. And why can't we look at it in that realm? And I'm a skier, and I'm a fisherman and a hunter, and I really love our outdoors and mountain biking and all that stuff. All the equipment that I use to do those public land sports come from mining or oil and gas or fossil fuels. I think we need to change that narrative and say, how can we all live with everything and still enjoy the public lands and be good stewards of the lands?
Deputy Director Anderson?
Yeah, I mean, recreation is huge, and the opportunities that are provided by our public lands clearly are drawing businesses here. People want to live in Utah. I mean, like Reg, I use our public lands. I hunt and fish and hike and ATV all across Utah, and so it's a wonderful thing. I think Reg hit on an important point. A lot of these uses are not mutually exclusive, and it's not an either or decision. It's a lot of and decisions. We can have both at the same time, and sometimes these uses can benefit each other. Great example is on Forest Service land. At all times you put in stock ponds to store water for cattle. And those stock ponds also used by wildlife. And so it can benefit the wildlife while also benefiting the pocketbooks of grazers. I think the other thing that we need to remember too is a lot of this money is remaining on the Wasatch Front that is coming by these companies. It's between Nephi and Brigham City. And it's not getting to these other areas. It's not getting to the Uinta Basin. It's not getting to Kane County or San Juan County or some of our rural communities. And so they're going to be dependent on energy. You're not going to get a Silicon Slopes business likely locating to the Uinta Basin anytime soon. And while they do have some tourism, which helps, it's not enough to sustain life out there and the folks out there. And so you're going to have these industries and including solar too, and wind and geothermal and everything else. You're going to have energy production to sustain these communities.
Thank you. And Mr. Myers?
Thanks, Angela. I think a slight twist on the question was regarding the indirect benefits of companies coming here or staying here to enjoy the recreational and outdoors opportunities, but there are also indirect consequences. And what I mean simply by that is that as more and more people move to Utah, there's going to be more and more pressure on the public lands for all of the multiple uses that those lands provide. And you can go through the FLTMA list of those multiple uses, mining, recreation, ranching, scenic opportunities, historical, cultural, et cetera. But everybody's going to bring their own desire to those public lands. And as more people bring those desires, there's going to be more pressure on those lands. And so I think the debate over these issues is going to intensify.
Thank you. The next question is for Director Johnson. And this is probably an entire afternoon conversation, but can you please provide an update on the state and county's RS-2477 litigation and where you see this work going for the next 3 years during the Biden administration?
So thank you for the recognition that this is a very long conversation to have. So I'm going to keep it very short because we really can't go into and give it due that it deserves here. Long story short, we finished with the bellwether. We continued on path. We're starting up depositions again. After COVID, we did take a little break due to COVID. We're starting those again in the next month or so. We will continue on in the next 3 years. And we did have a slight win on the Burr Trail recently with a lawsuit down there. And it was about the scope of a road and whether the BLM had the authority to do some improvements, and they had claimed it was an RS-2477 road and gave some authorizations there. So a few wins here and there, but it's a long road. It's been in litigation for a long time and probably will be for a while. But I would like to point out to the listeners, though, that if you're somebody that goes out and you're a stargazer, or you like to go out and enjoy your public lands, or you're a mountain biker or a rock climber or things like that, these RS-2477 routes, this is access to your recreation opportunities. This is how we get out to our public lands. And too often, the narrative around this is that we're trying to keep these open for just the extractive industries, but it couldn't be further from the truth. Most of these roads are recreation-oriented roads. And so if you enjoy your public lands recreation, we hope you'll support the efforts to keep these RS-2477 routes open. Thanks.
And we probably have time for just one more quick question, and I'm not sure who may be the appropriate person for this, but in regards to the pause on federal oil and gas leasing, but the question is really towards impacts on tribal lands and minerals. And if anyone has any knowledge of any impending tribal litigation regarding sovereignty and self-determination. Obviously the pause only pertained to federal oil and gas leases. It specifically did not apply to tribal lands, tribal leases. But if there's anyone that would like to further comment on anything that they are aware of with the tribal lands.
I'll just give some background on that. When the oil and gas moratorium first came out, tribal lands were included, especially in the basin with the Ute tribe. The Ute tribe did petition the Biden administration and got an exemption. And so they are exempt from that. Just wanted to give that as some background there. And so they're not having the impacts that we're seeing in other parts of Utah.
Well, we're actually on the hour. I want to thank our panelists, but if you would take 30 seconds and make any final comments that you would like to share with our audience. Again, we'll just start with you, Professor Ruppel, and go around in the same order.
Thanks, Angela. I think I'd close just by pointing out that obviously this is a time of dynamic change, and I think change can be either seen as an opportunity or it can be seen as an obstacle. Setting aside policy, it's less expensive to produce electric energy from solar and wind than from burning coal or natural gas. It's just an economic reality. And that cost differential only expands when you think about adding in the cost of carbon capture and sequestration. So I think that's a reality. And we're seeing that from major financiers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and their reluctance to invest in hydrocarbon-based energy production. So I think we have a decision point. We're kind of at an inflection point. We have to question whether we are going to push back against what feels like a pretty strong trend, or whether we are going to step back, embrace the opportunity, both as a business opportunity and as a question about how we as a society are going to help those rural communities and those communities that previously have been dependent on oil and gas transition to what I think is a foreseeable future. So thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thanks, John. Maybe I'll go next. I didn't hear Angela, but I want to thank everybody on this panel today. I want to thank all of those who took time to watch and participate as attendees. I think it's interesting as we've heard all the panelists with some different perspectives on this. It seems to me like what we all have in common is that we do have a passion that our public lands are available and properly managed, be that for any number of resources as we talked about under FLIPMA or other laws that dictate that. But I think we all share an interest to making sure we do that responsibly so that these beautiful landscapes are still here in the future, and that we're still able to provide the resources that we need to make sure our economy survives and move forward. So here at Bureau of Land Management, we try to take a view of balance and work through all of those different strategies as best we can. And there's a lot of perspectives out there of how you manage public land. For any of those of you who've been in public land management, that there's a lot of push and pull and tug of war and different opinions. But I do generally tend to believe that all of us have a great passion for our public lands and what those can produce for us, be that from recreation to energy resources and others. So I look forward to continue to serve all of you and serve this administration and making sure that those continue forward. So thank you.
Director Johnson.
Thank you. It's been great being here with you today, and I appreciate the time. And I would just kind of reiterate what Greg said. Our public lands are truly a treasure, both from the recreation side, but also from producing the vital minerals and energy that we need. And whether you're promoting energy in the renewable field, as John wants, and or from the fossil fuel industry. And I think what's going to happen is a transition. We can't just shut down oil and gas without having the proper amounts of minerals available to create the wind turbines and the solar, and maybe it's nuclear. there are options out there, but I hope the new administration goes forward with caution on how we make this transition. I think John's right. There is a transition in the works. I'm thrilled to be here in my position because it's a challenge to see and kind of help form how we make that transition, while still at the same time being good stewards of these landscapes so that in 500 or 1,000 years, folks are still able to enjoy these wonderful public lands we have. So thanks for your time.
Deputy Director Anderson.
Yeah, thank you for everyone for your comments. This was a wonderful event with a lot of great perspectives. Utah's energy future is very bright. Utah is positioned to not only be able to meet our energy needs for the future, but also those of other states, and continue to be a net exporter of energy. But again, as I mentioned, federal lands are going to be a key component of that, whether it's mining for critical minerals, and in the transition that we're seeing, like John mentioned, or being able to place solar, geothermal, or wind turbines on our federal lands. We're going to need access to those in order to produce the energy that we need. I think, again, there's so much potential out there, and I think there's far more agreement than there is disagreement. And doing things slow, methodically, and in a way where we collaborate with each other will not only be good for us, will be good for our public lands as well.
Mr. Myers.
Thanks again, Angela, for inviting me to participate. Angela and I represent private sector clients, and so I come to this closing comment with that perspective. And for companies, mom and pop businesses or international conglomerates and everything in between that deals with and works on and takes advantage of public lands, one of the best and key attributes is predictability. And it's frankly difficult when an administration changes every 4 years, and that's a nonpartisan comment. Whenever an administration changes, there's a whipsaw effect of the regulatory regime that overlays the use of those federal lands. So for those clients that I represent, the watchword would be predictability. Give them a set of rules, stick with them, and then they can plan. And they'll plan around them if they have to, but they'll plan. But if you change it every few months or years, it's very difficult. And the sage grouse that I led off with is perhaps the best example. BLM has issued plans in 2015, 2019, likely to do so again in 2020. Fish and Wildlife Service has made multiple listing decisions that have changed over those same years. And it's frankly very difficult for anyone who wants to enjoy those public lands from either a private sector or a public sector perspective or individual perspective to know what the rules are. So those, I think, are the primary challenges that the Biden administration is going to face.
Thank you, Mr. Myers, and I want to thank all of our panelists. We truly appreciate your insights, your comments, and your time. And I also want to thank our audience members. We appreciate your time and interest and hope that you have a better understanding of the opportunities and challenges available on our public lands. And we hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.
On behalf of Utah Business, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Angela, for moderating this discussion, and thank you, Holland Hart, for putting this together for us. For those of you still with us, if you had a question that we didn't get to answer today, please feel free to contact us at utahbusiness.com, and we will put you in touch with Angela and our friends at Holland and Hart. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and we'll have this video of our webinar today online on utahbusiness.com shortly. So keep an eye out for that and don't miss our next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.